You may think a country begins with one king, one victory, one instant. But what if the first Egyptian state was really born from a river, 1,000 villages, and one man, who appeared exactly when history was finally ready to become a kingdom?
You may think the birth of a country should have a clean answer. One founder, one crown. One moment when history suddenly becomes visible. That is how modern imagination prefers its origins. Sharp, named, and sealed. So when people ask who created the first Egyptian state, the mind reaches instinctively for a single figure standing above the Nile, lifting a scepter as if an entire civilization could be summoned by one gesture. But the valley resists that kind of simplicity. Before Egypt became a kingdom, it was a long green ribbon cut through a sea of sand. Before there was one throne, there were many communities. Before there was one royal name, there were villages, granaries, rival chiefs, symbols of status and slow accumulations of power pressing against one another along the river. The first Egyptian state did not rise like a house built in a day. It gathered like floodwater. It thickened like mud after the river withdrew. It formed out of land, water, food, rivalry, ambition, and memory. And yet, as the haze of prehistory begins to thin, two names step forward from the dark. Narmer, menace. The question tightens. Was Egypt created by one king, remembered by another name, or by a long process that only later learned how to wear a face? That is why the origin of Egypt feels both simple and elusive at once. The closer we move toward the beginning, the less it resembles a clean founding, and the more it resembles a civilization gradually compressing itself toward a single center. Egypt was not called into existence from emptiness. It condensed.
What do you think existed here before Egypt existed? Not emptiness, not silence, not a vacant land waiting for a founder. Long before the famous Pharaohs, the Nile already sustained chains of farming communities moving through the same severe rhythm year after year. Flood, retreat, sowing, growth, harvest, storage, waiting. Small granaries filled and emptied. Families watched the waterline and learned to live by repetition. But repetition alone does not make a state. Over time, surpluses accumulated. Some families controlled more grain, more land, and more labor than others. Some burials became richer, heavier with status, goods, and symbolic power. Local chiefs stopped looking like merely strong men inside villages. They began to look like centers of organized territories. At Hierakonpolis, at Makata, at Abydos, power was thickening into something larger than household life. Goods moved by boat. Ritual objects became more standardized. Elite tombs declared that inequality was no longer incidental. The valley was filling with competing nuclei of command. This is the first correction the story demands. Egypt was not created out of nothing. It was assembled from many communities becoming too large, too unequal, and too entangled to remain only communities. The river did not just feed people, it connected them, compared them, ranked them, and eventually forced them into larger political forms. Egypt began before Egypt had a single name for itself.
Why does food matter so much in the birth of a state? Because no kingdom begins with a crown. It begins with stable grain. Fields heavy with barley and wheat mean more than survival. They mean storage, counting, specialists, and the first genuine opportunity for power to grow beyond the village. Once surplus exists, not everyone needs to farm directly. Artisans can make pottery, ritual vessels, prestige objects, and marks of rank. Administrators can stand beside storerooms and record what others have produced. Early tags, ceilings, and controlled containers begin to turn wealth into something measurable, transferable, and governable. A chief receiving deliveries on an elevated platform is no longer just impressive. He is becoming administrative. The state, in its earliest form, is not only a warrior with a mace. It is a system that can hold grain in one place, record it, protect it, move it, and redistribute it. Rich tombs are therefore not just displays of vanity. They are signs that power has learned to collect. Large granaries are not just buildings. They are the bones of authority. By the time the first Egyptian state is near, its backbone is already visible. Nile agriculture, surplus, hierarchy, transport, symbolic prestige, and the slow invention of management. This is where power stops being merely personal and starts becoming structural. Whoever controls food begins to control time, labor, and obedience.
What happens when several growing centers realize that only one can dominate the valley? Competition hardens. Tribute begins to flow from weaker places towards stronger ones. Armed retainers stand behind local rulers. Emblems rise over territories like declarations of ambition. Somewhere, a rival symbol is seized. Somewhere, an elite burial grows larger after victory. Somewhere, a smaller district loses the right to remain fully itself. The first Egyptian state does not emerge from a peaceful council of equals. It emerges from struggle, absorption, coercion, alliance, and the conversion of force into legitimacy. But force alone is never enough. In a land as long as Egypt, victory must be made to look correct. It must appear as more than conquest. It must feel like the proper arrangement of the world. That is why triumph becomes ritual. That is why defeated enemies come to represent more than flesh and blood. They become visible forms of disorder being pressed beneath a new center. By the end of this phase, the whole valley feels compressed toward one decisive outcome. The many fires along the Nile are no longer separate lights. They are being drawn toward one blaze. Egypt was not talked into unity. It was driven toward it by escalating political gravity.
Who then stands most clearly at the moment when process becomes person? Narmer. He appears at the edge of history not as a myth floating above evidence, but as the strongest archaeological candidate for the king who unified Egypt near the end of the 4th millennium BCE, often placed roughly around 3150 to 3100 BCE. Dates this ancient always carry uncertainty, but Narmer stands closer to the evidence than almost any name around him. He is shown with crowns, with victory, with ritual authority, with tributaries before him, with the posture of someone who is no longer merely ruling a district. He looks along the Nile as if he understands what the entire long story had been preparing. Whoever controls this river axis can control a country. Yet the point is not to turn him into a lone genius dropped from nowhere. Narmer matters precisely because he is the brightest figure at the end of a long buildup. He is the face history sees when centuries of food, conflict, prestige, administration, and geography finally crystallize into unified kingship. If you need one name, he is the strongest one. If you need the whole truth, his clarity only makes sense against the darkness behind him. Narmer is powerful not because he explains everything alone, but because he stands where scattered developments suddenly become legible as one political transformation.
What do you think the Narmer Palette really is? A record, or ritual, or a proclamation? In truth, it is powerful because it sits at the meeting point of all three. This great carved stone object does not behave like a modern photograph of an event. It behaves like a ceremonial statement that unification happened, that victory was sacred, and that one king now held both lands. On one side, Narmer wears one crown. On the other, a different crown. Together, the images make a claim larger than a single battle. The ruler is shown towering above others, following the visual grammar of sacred hierarchy. His lifted mace is not only military action, it is force transformed into rightful order. The defeated enemy is not just a man, he is disorder pressed beneath control. Animal symbols, ritual forms, and divine overtones make the whole object say more than administration ever could. This is why the palette matters so much. It is not the birth certificate of Egypt in a legal sense, it is stronger than that. It is the first monumental image through which a unified Egyptian state announces itself as real, victorious, and cosmically justified. In one artifact, politics, ritual, violence, kingship, and symbolism lock together. The state is not merely formed here, it declares itself.
Then why does another name, Menes, keep echoing through later history? Because memory does not preserve the past in the same way archaeology does. Later king lists and classical traditions wanted a founder who could be named cleanly, remembered easily, and honored as the origin of unified Egypt. Menes became that remembered founder. Traditional summaries still reflect that memory, while modern scholarship places greater weight on Narmer's archaeological visibility. This creates one of the most important tensions in the story. Menes may have been Narmer under another later remembered name. Menes may instead have been Hor-Aha, Narmer's successor in the earliest First Dynasty. the evidence does not close that question perfectly, and that matters. Good history does not pretend uncertainty does not exist. It ranks degrees of confidence. What is highly likely is that unification belongs to the late pre-dynastic transition into the First Dynasty, and that Narmer is the strongest historically grounded candidate at its center. What is less certain is the exact relationship between Narmer and Menes. So the careful answer is not to erase one name with the other. It is to understand that Narmer is the face of evidence, while Menes is the face of later memory. This is not confusion. It is the normal tension between what a civilization remembers and what the surviving record can most securely support.
But can a king truly create a state by victory alone? Not in Egypt. A triumph must become a mechanism. The Nile makes this possible because it is not only a river of food, but a river of connection. Egypt is long, narrow, and unusually suited to control along one fluvial axis. Once a strong center grips that axis, territorial unification becomes practical. Yet practicality still demands administration. Grain must be collected and redistributed. Goods must be sealed. Tribute must be recorded. Labor must be directed. Storerooms must function. Ritual centers must legitimize rule. Early scribes and managing officials matter here as much as warriors. Hor-Aha and the earliest dynasty kings matter too, because initial victory had to be converted into durable order. This is where the pharaonic model begins to show itself. Kingship is not simply force at the top. It is force wrapped in symbol, management wrapped in ritual, and politics fused with sacred legitimacy. The founder of the first Egyptian state, therefore, begins more than a line of rulers. He begins a form of power that can endure, repeat, and stretch across millennia. Egypt becomes a state not when enemies merely fall, but when collection, redistribution, writing, ritual, and rule begin to move in one direction.
So, who created the first Egyptian state? If you need the shortest answer, grounded in current scholarship, Narmer is the strongest candidate for the ruler who unified Egypt and opened the first state, while Menes is the traditional later name attached to that founder. But the deeper answer is larger and more honest. The first Egyptian state was born from centuries along the Nile, from farming villages, surplus grain, elite competition, local power centers, conflict, absorption, administrative invention, symbolic rule, and a landscape uniquely suited to unification once one center became dominant. Narmer stands at the brightest point of that transformation. Menes preserves it in memory. The Nile makes it possible beneath them both. That is why the question matters. It teaches us that states are rarely created by declaration alone. They are condensed from long pressure. They grow in granaries, tombs, river traffic, rituals, rivalries, and names that only later become clear. Egypt was not conjured into being by one gesture. It gathered for generations, and then, at one decisive threshold, found a king whose face could carry the weight of becoming a state. Narmer is the clearest face of the founding moment. But Egypt was created by a river, a long struggle, and a process older than any one king.